Good evening, everyone. So we're just going to start off this session today with a small piece of work that we have been working over the last 3 months or so. And in this part where I present is just the introduction to this paper, as well as where it just covers the events that transpired in the debt crisis until so far, and what kind of so-called treatments the establishment has presented. Along with it, I will also give a brief, very brief outline of what kind of impacts this has made to the working class, because the next panel, where I think everyone will go into more depth of what kind of impacts this has, the current trajectory, economic policy trajectory has done to people. So I just start off with mapping out what has happened so far. As of April, it's been 2 years since we defaulted on our external debt. And as everyone knows, like back then, it was just a standstill on debt. We didn't get any support financially from the international architecture. And it's been an year for May, I believe, since the IMF agreement, the 17th IMF agreement. And there we get, for now, now we get $660 million US annually for the next 4 years. But something that everyone keeps forgetting is that we pay surcharges and interest rates on this IMF loan. And for the next 8 years, from 2024 to 2033, we'll be paying $2 billion as interest rates and surcharges on, or US $2 billion on the IMF loan. So in terms of the treatment of this crisis, what we've seen is that the main focuses have been on primary surplus balance, primary surplus of the government, and targeting inflation so as to reduce it. So in the last year, in 2023, we've gone to a 6% surplus in the primary balance, compared to a 3.7 deficit in 2022, and that is a massive jump. And this year, from this year onwards, the central bank expects to control our inflation rate at 5%. So these two targets, in terms of macroeconomic targets, have come at the expense of dispossessing so many people. In terms of the primary surplus, we saw one policy was to bring in price mechanisms to control, to sort of make pricing formulas for energy. And these pricing formulas have increased electricity costs by 400% over the last year itself, last 2 years since 2022. While CEB records profits of 52 billion rupees in the last year, it has come at the cost of dispossessing over 1 million people. Then we had the regressive taxes that we imposed, like the VAT, and this comes at a time at high cost of living. So while 9 out of 10 families have increased their household expenditure, and 6 out of 10 are facing a reduction in their income, on top of this 50% reduction in the real value of their incomes, we see that the government tries to impose more regressive taxes. Taxes that, like VAT, that the burden is shared by working people. It's not, taxation should come based on the principle of redistribution, but it's not based on the principles of redistribution. It's rather based on the IMF principle that what is the fastest way of earning a government income, and therefore let's implement it, let's go ahead with it. So all these austerity measures are to meet the debt sustainability needs of the IMF through a primary surplus. So we are also dispossessing people in terms of our social protection system, and we know that since during COVID, Sri Lanka was one of the countries that spent the least amount on social protection, and right now the IMF program itself has capped the spending on social protection at a 0.6% of GDP, and there have been massive cuts to the social protection through the new Aswasuma program. And this doesn't only mean dispossessing people of any financial assistance from the state, it also means dispossessing them the right to connect and engage with the state. We also saw one of the last treatments is that instead of restructuring our external debt, which is the debt we defaulted on, we first went and restructured our superannuation funds, our EPF and ETF. These cuts are the only savings to working people, as everyone knows. And because of the crisis that materialized in 2020, people have faced a reduction in the value of their EPF by 40%. And on top of it, in the next 10 years, we will see a reduction in the value of their savings by 30% more. So these so-called treatments are not just happening to the lives that people are realizing, living presently, but through these reforms, we are going to see an onslaught on people's futures. And it's all just to treat an external debt crisis. So why are we here for the 17th time at the IMF? What happened to the last 16 agreements? All these solutions are focused on liberalizing trade, making sure that we are dependent on imports, and therefore undermining local production. It also comes at the fire sale of local assets, of public assets, and state-owned enterprises, and services that people access. And why are we going through this entire structural reform process is to return to private credit markets for development. And therein lies the problem. Why are we relying on private commercial credit for development, for mitigating and facing climate risks? This is not just a problem for Sri Lanka. It's a problem for the entire global south and therefore a global crisis. We are in a global debt crisis. Since the global financial crisis in 2007, the debt of developing countries have doubled. 62% of developing countries' external debt are owed to private creditors. We are relying on private credit for our development needs. So the problem here with the private credit markets is, the biggest problem is that there is a discrepancy in the charges that we owe and pay to these private creditors. So when the UNCTAD had done a report on this, and it stated that when Germany pays at least 1.5% in charges for the private credit they get, countries like Africa pay 11%, and Asian countries pay about 6.5%, whereas America, the USA, pays about 3.1%. So we are charged this extra fee called the risk premium, but when this risk transpires, we're still owed the entirety of our debt. We are not given bigger cuts even when this risk materializes. So in developing countries, we pay about 60.5% of our public expenditure to repay debts, whereas we pay 40% for education, 55% for health. And this is a massive problem when it comes to countries like us. Where do we go to get debt? We still need debt, sure. But is the private credit markets the place to go? No. Then why is the IMF keeps on pushing us to go into these markets? Why are we doing all these reforms to make sure that we are attractive enough to go and return back to these markets? Since COVID, there have been so many countries in the global south that have defaulted. Ghana, Suriname, Zambia, Lebanon, Sri Lanka just been one. We have been able to get out of our IMF agreements previously, but this time it's really hard for us because we have defaulted on this credit. And I think Amali and Dr. Ahilan will present more on this. So the treatments for this crisis are repeatedly treating our cases of debt crisis as a national governance and economic governance crisis, as opposed to, and a corruption issue, as opposed to a corruption issue of the larger global financial architecture.